Beautiful day in the Ozarks. We had snow, ice, chilly temperatures all weekend, and today the sun popped out and it's in the 50s. And I tell you, it's just a gorgeous day for January. So, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to last. I believe we're going to be back with the snow and the ice here in a few days. Well, we've been discussing for the last uh, several weeks the history of the American West. And today we're going to start talking about the migration of the immigrants westward into the American West. We're going to start by talking about the Oregon and the Santa Fe trails. And then next week, we're going to talk about the Mormon experience. And the week after that, we'll talk about the gold prospecting, particularly the 49ers. And then we'll finish up that segment with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And then we'll get into what is typically referred to as the Wild West, which I know a lot of people will be interested in at that point. So let's see what we can say about the Oregon and the Santa Fe trails. As always, I try to start my presentations off with a painting. And this is a painting called A Wagon Train on the Plains by Thomas Worthington Whitridge. It's a beautiful painting, and it probably pretty accurately depicts what a wagon train would have faced and looked like going westward. So today we're going to talk about two trails. We're going to start with the Santa Fe Trail, which was actually more of a merchant trail than it was an immigrant trail. It eventually became a trail for immigrants westward, particularly in the 40s and the 50s with the gold rush into California. But at least initially, the Santa Fe Trail was a trail that was established to bring goods to originally Mexico from the United States, and then that switched primarily to the area which we now know as New Mexico and Arizona and that area. And that's why it's referred to as the Santa Fe Trail. It had its origins in 1821. A man by the name of William Becknell was actually on his way to Mexico when the Mexican government overthrew the Spanish government and declared its independence. Becknell didn't know for sure how well he would be received if he continued on into Mexico. Met favor and decided, hey, there's money to be made here. And so he turned around and headed back across the plains, returned to Missouri, Independence, Missouri, loaded up 3 more wagons, headed back down to Santa Fe, and turned a really great profit, about 2,000% on his goods. And he said, hey, this is something I think we better continue with. In the process of establishing what we now know as the Santa Fe Trail, he found the bypass of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which is the southern edge of the Rockies, and made it a lot easier to get to Santa Fe. And the result was that he is generally referred to as the father of the Santa Fe Trail. And here is kind of a map which will show you the Santa Fe Trail. Starts up here, actually in Westport, Kansas City. Shows it from Boonville, but for the most part, it started in Kansas City, Independence, that area. Went down through what we now know as Council Groves, over through Pawnee Rock and Fort Larned, which was a fort that was established later, to reach a little town called Cimarron. Now, the original Santa Fe Trail went north at this point and went around the mountains this way and came down to Santa Fe through here. He established the Cimarron cutoff, which came through the panhandle of Texas and across the desert in this area through here. So that's the route of the original Santa Fe Trail. He wasn't the only one that figured out there was money to be made. There was a couple of brothers by the name of William and Charles Bent. And they decided that rather than just haul goods to Santa Fe, they would build a trading post out in the middle of what for them was nowhere. And they established a trading post out in southern Colorado, southeastern Colorado, and it grew immensely. And eventually, they ended up building an adobe-like fort at that site. And it became the major stopover, not just for the Santa Fe Trail, but for traders all throughout the southern part of the western United States, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. They all traveled to Bent's Fort because it was kind of the Walmart of the time. It was where you wanted to go if you wanted to, buy something out in that part of the country at that time. And this adobe fort became an institution. They also got along fairly well with the Indians, primarily because William, one of the brothers, married into the Cheyenne tribe, and he was able to negotiate a peace with the tribes, and they pretty much left him alone. It was one of the forts in one of the areas that wasn't really bothered. Charles eventually was killed during the Mexican War. He went to New Mexico and Taos and was met by some of the Indians and was killed during the Mexican War. William eventually, the bottom of the fur trade, of course, went out in the 1840s, and the Santa Fe Trail kind of lost its steam as a merchant's trail. And as a result of a cholera epidemic striking the Indians in that area and causing all sorts of problems, instead of trying to resurrect his fort and trying to keep it alive, he actually just blew the thing up. He just set dynamite all around it, blew the fort up, returned to Missouri, where he lived the rest of his life. Now, the old Bent's Fort is no longer there, but you can go to where Bent's Fort was, and they have built a replica of it. And it's in southeastern Colorado, and this is a replica. This is the actual historic site of Bent's Fort, and the National Park Service has built a replica of it. And you can see it looks like a fort. I mean, it was a pretty sturdy thing, and had real thick adobe walls, and was very protective. And everybody, Kit Carson, John C. Fremont, all the fur trappers of notoriety, they all spent time at Bent's Fort. This was the place to be at this time on the Santa Fe Trail. Eventually, the trail was expanded westward into California, particularly during the gold rush period. And later on, it became more of an immigrant trail than a merchant trail. And so this became known as the California Trail from Santa Fe westward to California. There were actually two parts of it. One looped south along the Gila River, but the major trail looped north over what we now know as Las Vegas, and then down across the mountains and the desert to Los Angeles. There was also a loop off that went up to Salt Lake City to kind of work with the Mormons as they established that area. So by the 1840s, pioneers were just using this trail constantly to move westward along the southern route. But it wasn't nearly as used as was the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was a much easier trail because the Santa Fe Trail, you had to go over deserts. It wasn't really an accommodating trail for migrants. The Oregon Trail was quite different. This is the old Spanish Trail. As I said, this is the Trail of California. Here's Santa Fe, and from here, the main trail looped north of the Grand Canyon in that area, looped down around the little town of Las Vegas, which wasn't much then, to say the least, crossed the desert into Los Angeles. And then here's the loop off if you wanted to go up into Salt Lake City in that area. So that was the old Spanish Trail, as they called it. But the real migrant experience in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s occurred in Oregon. that's where everybody wanted to be. Oregon was kind of being portrayed as almost a Garden of Eden. And I'll be honest, I've never been in the Pacific Northwest, so I can't say this from firsthand experience, but I've talked to many people that have lived in Oregon, Washington, uh, and they say it is absolutely some of the most lovely country that they've ever lived in and seen, particularly the Willamette Valley. And as they get there, they begin to write pamphlets, and there was land speculators that began to speculate on land, and they had a real economic desire to bring immigrants westward in Oregon. And so it really began being promoted as, like I said, almost a Garden of Eden. And this so happened to occur about the time that manifest destiny and expansionism was reaching the fever pitch. And so it's no surprise that during the 1830s and particularly the 1840s and 1850s, thousands upon thousands of people went over the Oregon Trail. It's been estimated that over 500,000 people traveled the Oregon Trail in the 3 decades of the 30s to 40s and the 50s. It primarily followed the old Lewis and Clark Trail up into you got up into the mountains, and then there were some different areas that were expanded, and some of the fur traders found easier routes westward over the mountains. But it primarily traveled the old Lewis and Clark Trail. By 1845, the number crossing the trail reached 5,000. By 1850, over 50,000 people crossed the Oregon Trail in that one year. It was just it was almost like a highway. It was the Interstate 44, the Route 66 of its time. You can still see the wagon ruts. There are several state parks in the West that feature these, and this is one of them. And I'll be honest, I don't know where it's at for sure. I think it may be in Idaho, but this is what they call the Oregon Trail Ruts State Historic Site. And it was just, you can see it was a path, and it was a well-traveled path. And most of these wagon trains had guides. A lot of them were old mountain men, and so they knew the way really well. And it was a really quite an experience, for those people. Now, for the most part, the people traveling west were men until about the mid 1830s. And in the mid 1830s, you begin to see a traveling west of families. The first families that we know of that traveled west in wagon trains was the Whitman and Spalding families. 1836, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, along with Henry and Eliza Spalding. They were missionaries. They had joined a group of people in the East who decided it was necessary to go west to try to proselytize to the Indians that were located in the Oregon Valley, the Walla Walla Valley, the Willamette Valley. And so they, after much thought and preparation, headed west to basically set up an evangelizing mission. And in addition, Marcus Whitman was a doctor. And so he also used his skill as a doctor to help treat the Indians, which proved to be not so good in the long run, as you'll see in a little bit. They went there, they tried to convert the Cayuse Indians of the valley to Christianity, and while they met with some success, they were just never really quite accepted as much as they thought they would be. Particularly from my reading of this time period, Narcissa particularly wasn't very well accepted by the Native American tribe. She was a good woman. She'd set up an orphanage, and she helped with the Indians, but there was something about her character, her nature, that just didn't set well with the American Indians, apparently, because they had some real misgivings about Narcissa, not so much Marcus. This is a drawing of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman. And so they were basically the first families, along with the Spauldings, to travel over the Oregon Trail and to establish, you know, an establishment of mission as such in the Oregon Valley. The mission itself became a real important stopover on the Oregon Trail. And as I said, Marcus Whitman was the doctor, and needless to say, there was always a demand for a doctor in these times. You know, they always wanted to, you know, make sure that there was always somebody sick on these wagon trains, and a lot of people died, and so he was in much demand as such. And as I mentioned, Narcissa established a school for orphans, Indians, and it was a pretty flourishing thing. Pardon me while I get a drink. My voice gets a little hoarse after a few minutes of talking. I used to be able to talk for 6 hours at a time and never even knew it. Now I can't talk for half an hour at a time. Well, my wife says I can, but that's another story. Okay. The Cayuse began to view the growing group of white settlers with a little bit of, you know, mistrust. They begin to think there's more of these people coming here than we thought were going to. And then disaster struck. 1847, measles epidemic broke out in the Walla Walla Valley, where the Whitman mission was. And it was just devastating, not just to the white people, but particularly to the Indian population. They had no natural immunity, and it was just deadly. Marcus Whitman did everything he could, and he was able to basically save a lot of the white children because they had some natural immunity to it. But the Indian children just began to die in massive numbers, particularly, as well as some of the adults. This is the site of the Whitman mission. It is no longer there. They've never rebuilt it. It was destroyed, and for some reasons, they've just chosen not to rebuild it as they did some of the other natural historic sites along the Oregon Trail and some of the western parts. Anyway, Marcus Whitman decided, or not decide, but he did treat the chief of the Cayuse tribe. His child got measles, and unfortunately it died. Now, Marcus had gotten along very well with the tribe, and they really liked him as such. Unfortunately, amongst the Cayuse tribe, the tradition was that a medicine man that failed had to pay for his own life. And as a result, the Indian chief, along with one of his followers, a man by the name of Tomahas, went to the mission on the night of November 29th, 1847, broke into the mission and killed Marcus Whitman with an axe. And then they turned their vengeance upon Narcissa, even some of the white children. They killed her as well. They killed several of the children. They sexually assaulted a few and took off because they knew that probably vengeance was coming on the part of the white man, and it did. And for the next 2 years, there was a war that raged in the Walla Walla Valley in the area of Oregon that became known as the Cayuse War. Kind of halted immigration for a couple of years. Once it was settled, and once they captured the Indians that were involved, they hung them, and incidentally, they killed several more. It kind of ended the threat, and you begin to see immigration once again come into the Oregon area. Now, how did these immigrants get here? Well, eventually they came by wagon train. I bet you a lot of you out there watched the old TV series Wagon Train, and you know it's actually fairly accurate, with one exception. I'll mention here in a minute what the exception was. Most of them crossed over the Oregon Trail in a prairie schooner. It was better known as a covered wagon. It was a 4x10 box, and it could hold up to 2,400 pounds of cargo. And the migrants tried to cram as much stuff as they could in there. food stuff, as well as household articles, personal effects. Most of them were pulled by oxen. Now, on the TV series and most movies and all this, you always see the wagon trains being pulled by horses. Folks, that wouldn't have happened. Horses were not up to pulling these prairie schooners long distances. Mules, maybe some of them over across the prairie. Maybe they could have used mules to a degree, but by far and away, probably 90% of these wagon trains were pulled by oxen. They were slow, but they were sturdy, and they were oxes. And I mean, they were strong. On top of that, if you got in trouble, you could butcher one and eat it. And so it was food stuff. So for the most part, oxen were used, not horses, as you see in the TV shows and in the movies. Most of the wagon trains were made up of around 50 to 60 wagons, maybe a couple hundred men, women, and children. They were led by a guide, and these guides were usually old mountain men. They knew the way very well. And as the trail became more and more used, it became more and more established. And it got to the point where you probably could have headed west along the Oregon Trail without a guide. But that probably wasn't a very good idea unless you were a pretty rugged frontiersman yourself. It was a dangerous trail. Uh, Estimated at least 1 in 9 pioneers lost their life. By far and away, the major cause of death along the Oregon Trail was disease, particularly cholera, which is a waterborne disease of contaminated water. The second major cause of death was water crossing. You had to cross a lot of rivers on the Oregon Trail, and this always proved to be a very dangerous thing. Uh, I know it's popular in movies and TV shows to see the Indians swooping down upon the wagon trains and killing the pioneers and circling the wagons. That really didn't happen a whole lot, particularly in the beginning. Towards the end, when the Indian Wars broke out, it did happen more often. But at least in the beginnings, during the 1830s and 40s and early 50s, Indian attacks upon the wagon train just didn't happen very often because, frankly, the Indians, they weren't that upset with the white man traveling across their land as long as they kept on going. And on top of that, they would often trade with them, and sometimes they would charge them a toll. They would come up on them and basically say, "You owe us this." So many horses or oxen or cattle in order to cross our land. And rather than get into an argument, the pioneers usually did just that. So if you were going to cross the Oregon Trail, you had to start off in mid-May. You did not start later than May. If you started later than May, it was a disaster because somewhere along the line, the Rockies, the Cascades, particularly the Sierra Nevada mountains, if you're going to California, you were going to reach snow and you were going to get stranded. And that meant disaster. We'll see this in a couple of weeks when we talk about the California Trail and the 49ers. We'll talk about a certain incident that occurred at the Donner Party, which was a stranded group of immigrants across the Sierra Nevada mountains. And it was a disaster if you got stranded. This is an original picture. This is not a makeup picture. This is one of the pictures of one of the wagon trains headed western. And you'll notice they aren't being pulled by horses. They're being pulled by oxen. And this is what it would have looked like. This is a diagram of a prairie schooner. You can see the box and the wagon wheels. And these prairie schooners were just really sturdy things. And they eventually were used. They were kind of altered and used as chuck wagons later on in the cattle drives. And they were used for a long time. Later on, a company called the Springfield Wagon Company converted these prairie schooners into farm wagons. And by the way, the Springfield Wagon Company was located in downtown Springfield, Missouri, where I'm coming from. And it was a huge thing. It was the biggest maker of wagons in America at that time. It was kind of the Ford and the Chevrolet and the Chrysler of the time. Its rival was the Studebaker Wagon Company, which was the only wagon company that transferred over to vehicles at that time. Enough of that, though. Okay. So the trail itself, as I said, was basically the old Lewis and Clark Trail. Started in Independence, Missouri, a little town of about 5,000 people. It stretched for 2,000 miles across prairies, mountains, deserts, rivers, wasteland. It was a dangerous trail, as I mentioned. 1 in 9 died. Uh, some Indian attacks. Snake bite was pretty common. Buffalo stampedes were very common. Weather incidents, hail, tornadoes, whatever, snow or blizzards if you got caught late. Illness was really a danger. Starvation on occasion. Dangerous rapids, crossing of rivers, rock slides. It was a dangerous thing. A lot of children were born on the Oregon Trail. A lot of them didn't make it. A lot of young children died in childbirth, and many mothers did too. Those that crossed the Oregon Trail basically did not stay in the prairie. That was the Great American Desert, and that was thought to be at that time pretty much a wasteland. Later in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, people figured out they could farm that Great American Desert and make a whole lot of money growing wheat and corn. And that's what they did. This is the old Santa Fe Trail here. Or pardon me, the Oregon Trail, mixed up here. The Oregon Trail started in Independence. It did Santa Fe Trail. It went up through northeastern Kansas along the Blue River, the Big Blue. Then it traveled basically the Platte River through Nebraska till you got to Wyoming and crossing over the mountains till you got to Fort Bridger, or crossed over through here, which was called the Sublette Cutoff, up to Fort Hall. Now at Fort Hall, as you'll see, you could split off and head westward towards California. That became known as the California Trail, and we'll talk about that in another presentation, the 49ers presentation. But for today, we're going to talk about it. And it went on through Idaho, up across the mountains, and basically here was the Whitman Mission, and then across the Columbia River down to this area, and down through here was the Willamette Valley. This is the Walla Walla Valley up here. So that was the route of the Oregon Trail. So let's kind of follow it and see what it was like. About the first 2 weeks, you went across the Big Blue River, tributary of Kansas, or the Kansas River in the northeastern part. And from there, you reached the Platte River. And basically, most settlers followed the Platte River on the south bank for the most part through Nebraska. It was a little bit easier to travel. The Platte, by the way, has a very, very bad reputation. The old story is that it's bad to ford, destitute of fish, too dirty to bathe in, and too thick to drink. And another one is too thin to plow. The Platte's not that bad a river, but at least for people outside of Nebraska, they're a little disdainful of it, to say the least. There was always an abundance of animal life. You usually didn't have to worry about food in this part of the Oregon Trail. There was always antelope and coyote and bear and buffalo, always prairie dog villages, which could prove to be a problem, particularly if your horse broke a leg. You would have to kill it, or if you broke a leg, which often happened, and that was almost like a death sentence at this time. About 460 miles west of the Missouri River, about a month into the trip, you had to cross the south into the North Forks, and this was a pretty dangerous part of the travel, because this was there was a lot of rapids here and whirlpools. By the way, folks, I kind of bypassed this, and I didn't mean to. Most people that crossed the Oregon Trail walked. Not very many of them rode. There were some men that rode horses, and maybe the very elderly, or if you got sick, they would try to make room for you in the prairie schooner. But for the most part, they walked, every bit of it. particularly the women and the children. I hate to tell you that. Some men walked when they would walk beside the oxen to guide them. But for the most part, it was a walking trail, not a riding trail. They reached the North Fork, and uh, you had to ford it to get across the river. And this is where the North Fork and the South Fork come together. And like I said, this was kind of a dangerous thing until they began to find better fords to cross the river. And eventually, people got smart and would establish a ferry and ferry immigrants across the river. And that's where you end up making some money. The second month, basically, you crossed Nebraska. The first 22 miles after crossing over onto the North Fork of the Platte River was pretty much just kind of an uphill, waterless tableland. And then the last few miles, you went downhill till you got to a little place called Ash Hollow. And Ash Hollow was an oasis. It had woods, it had river, it had water, it was cool. It was really the first trees they had encountered almost since they'd left Independence. There were not very many trees on the plains at this time. Most trees that are out on the plains, they were planted by immigrants and settlers. But at this time, there was just almost no trees, natural trees at all. Ash Hollow was one of the exceptions, and I can only imagine how much they must have loved sitting in the shade trees of the ash trees. I'm assuming they were ash trees. The next 50 miles was an uphill grade from Ash Hollow. You bypassed a couple of places called Courthouse Rock and Chimney Rock, which were big landmarks on the Oregon Trail and still exist. I'll show you a picture of Chimney Rock in a minute. And then later on in Nebraska, they would reach Scotts Bluff. You had to reach Scotts Bluff in June, latter part of June. If you had not reached Scotts Bluff in the latter part of June, you were in trouble. And eventually, if you traveled on for a few more days, you would reach Fort Laramie in southeastern Wyoming. At that point, you were not yet quite a third of the way. Okay. Just imagine that. They had walked all this distance, 640 miles from Independence to Fort Laramie, and they weren't even a third of the way there. May and June, 2 months to get there. This is Chimney Rock. Some of you may have seen it in Nebraska. And not too far from it is a place called Courthouse Rock. This is Scotts Bluff, a little town, Scotts Bluff, Nebraska is right near that. And that's about 80 miles north of the interstate. Interstate 80 and 84 kind of roughly follow now the old Oregon Trail. Not totally, but kind of like I-44 and Route 66, kind of follow southwestward to, kind of follow some of the old Indian trails westward. This is Fort Laramie. It has been rebuilt, and it is a historic site now, and you can visit Fort Laramie. And this was kind of a big layover of the Oregon Trail. There's Army Depot there and traders, and you could resupply. From that point on, after you got past Fort Laramie, you had to cross the Rockies. Now, that wasn't as big a deal as everybody thought it was, because they had found, I kind of mentioned earlier during the fur trading days, they had found the South Pass. And the South Pass was almost like a meadow of about 7,000 feet in altitude. Before you got there, you followed the Sweetwater River a little ways, and then you came upon a huge dome of a rock. The story was you had to reach this rock by the 4th of July, or you would be late getting to your destination. It gained the name Independence Rock, and Independence Rock became the site of, I guess, the first graffiti on the Oregon Trail, because the story goes that settlers began to carve their names and write their names on the rock. And you can go there today and you can just see thousands upon thousands of what was signatures and everything on this rock today. It's still there. And about 80 miles west of Independence Rock, you reached the South Pass. And the South Pass, like I said, was kind of a disappointment. I think most people thought when they reached the Rockies, it was going to be a big experience. And it was more kind of like a meadow crossing over, which was good. It was good, but it was kind of a disappointment. This is Independence Rock. And this is the South Pass. And this is kind of part of the old Oregon Trail with the wagon ruts again. And you can see it just wasn't that much of a big deal, really. From there, the trail split. If you were getting behind, going to Oregon, you took the Sublets Cutoff, which is a 50-mile dry grassless tableland, but there wasn't very much water, very much grass for the animals. And it was kind of a risky deal. If you were making good time, you headed south basically to Fort Bridger. And, resupply it again. And if you were lucky, you listened to old fur trapper Jim Bridger sit on the front porch and tell you tall tales, and you would meet a legend. He did this for decades and made a lot of money and became probably the most famous old fur trapper and mountain man of the era, not because of what he did, but because he lived so long and lived on the Oregon Trail. From there, you reached Fort Hall. At Fort Hall, you made a decision. If you were headed southwest to California across the Sierra Nevadas, you turned southwest on the California Trail, or you continued on northwest on the Oregon Trail. This is Fort Bridger. It has been rebuilt, and this is what it would have looked like at the time. And like I said, old Jim Bridger sat in front here, and he would just regale the immigrants with tall tales of his fur trapping days and his mountain man days, and they loved it. He became an institution amongst the Oregon Trail. From there, you went on to Oregon. You followed the Snake River Valley into Idaho and across the mountains. Now, folks, this was tough. This was the worst part of the trail. It was really, really hard to get across. And at least in the beginning, it was very, very dangerous. Eventually, they built ferries to cross the rivers, and they found some passes. But at least in the beginning, this was by far and away the most dangerous part of the Oregon Trail, this 300 miles along the Snake River Valley. Eventually, you crossed over the Blue Mountains, and you got on a boat and a ferry, or you took the wheels off your wagon and made a boat out of it. Or sometimes you just followed along the riverbed, which was tough, and you followed the Columbia River down to basically the Pacific Ocean. If you were going to go up, south, you sometimes crossed over the Cascade Mountains, which were also very dangerous. You had to reach the mountains or the Columbia River by November. If you did not reach the river or the mountains by November, it was too late. You were in trouble. Final destination was Fort Vancouver, the Willamette Valley. Once you got there, it was worth it. This is the Snake River Valley. And as you can see, it's not a pleasant path. It was a hard place to go. This is one of the ferries that was established crossing over the Columbia River. And as you can see, this is eventually how the settlers began to get across the river and down the river, and it became a lot easier to deal with, at least in the latter stages of the Oregon Trail. And that's a photograph of the Columbia River heading west towards the Pacific Ocean. Of course, I always end with a recommendation of a book and a movie, or most times. As far as movies, there's an old movie called The Way West, and it basically follows a wagon train westward across the Oregon Trail. It's a very good movie. It's kind of long, as I recall. It's about 3 hours long. It's a lot longer than some movies that I've recommended, but it's a really good movie, and it shows you in pretty accurate detail what it was like crossing over the Oregon Trail in the beginning. As far as books, there's probably none better than the original. There was a historian traveled the Oregon Trail in the 1840s called Francis Parkman, and he wrote the story of the Oregon Trail. And folks, I've read it just a few years ago. Again, it's still just as good as it was the day it was written. It's one of the classics of Western writing. And if you're really interested in the Oregon Trail, I can't recommend anything better than reading Francis Parkman's Oregon Trail. Okay, next week, we're going to talk about the Mormon Trek. The Mormons were a group of religious people who were persecuted for their religious beliefs. And they eventually decided they were going to go somewhere where nobody would bother them. And they ended up in Utah, which at that time was about as far away from anybody as you could get. And they established the great city of Salt Lake City. And it's one of the really classic tales of Western expansion. They traveled almost en masse over a period of about 2 years. So we're going to see their experiences prior to going west, the persecutions that were involved with the Mormons, and then we'll talk about the establishment of the Salt Lake City, around the Salt Lake, Lake Salt Lake, and then we'll talk about their experiences afterwards, because their experiences of persecution eventually followed them clear to Salt Lake City, and they got involved in what was known as the Mormon War for a few years with the United States government. Probably would not have ended well had it not been for the outbreak of the Civil War, which kind of altered the priorities of the American military, and they were basically recalled to fight the American Civil War, and the Mormons were allowed to reestablish themselves and prosper. And so it turned out okay for them. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Next week, we'll talk about the Mormon Trek, as I said, and then the following week, we'll do the Gold Rush of 49, and finally, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is a terrific story. So I appreciate you being here today. Thank you. And Kayla, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Well,